This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. This is the podcast where we dive into the stories behind the storytellers. Today, we explore the shadowy edges of imagination with Chris Kauzlarich, author of Menagerie in the Dark, a speculative short story collection that ventures into the depths of human emotion and the darkness before dawn. Through 14 haunting yet hopeful tales, Chris examines sorrow, loneliness, deception, and redemption, illuminating how, even in our darkest hours, there's always a flicker of light waiting to be found. Chris is also the author of the suspense horror novella Lazarus and a member of the Authors Guild, AWP, and the Chicago Writers Association. He splits his time between Chicago and beautiful Naples, Florida. Happy to have Chris Kauzlarich join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me on.
It's great to have you here. Menagerie in the Dark explores the darker aspects of the human condition before bringing us back to the light. What inspired you to structure the collection around that emotional contrast?
Yeah, so what's interesting about this collection, because a lot of people ask me, how did you write the stories and kind of go through that arc? And originally, what happened is these are short stories that I had written over a 12-year period of time. So I write a lot of short stories, working on a novel as well, but the short story art form is something that I've spent a lot of time just when an idea would pop into my head, jot down, some ideas, a scene would happen, and then I have a small story that came of it. And I just push them to the side, kept them. Oh, maybe I'll expand on it one day, maybe I won't. And about 2 years ago, going into about a year and a half ago, I started looking through my old short stories, and I picked out my favorite ones. And when I looked at them as a collection, some of them didn't seem to go together thematically, because some of them have a more hopeful tone, some are horror, some of them just have this melancholic air to them. And as I was looking at them, I started almost unconsciously grouping them together. And that's where there was a light bulb moment for me where I went, oh, this is very interesting because some of these stories, they're very emotional, but they get darker as time goes on until I got to these pure horror stories, which kind of is part two of the collection Night, where it's like, oh yeah, I mean, this is as dark as it's gonna get. You have your pure horror. And then other stories toward the end where I really enjoyed them, they were more hopeful at the end. It was that light at the end of the tunnel. And as I'm collecting them, I saw, oh, this could be a really great thematic arc that I can follow, where we go from this dusk night to dawn idea of the stories get darker and darker. Where's the hope? And then you get toward the end, and as it's moving through the collection as you read them, you're like, oh, it's this bright new day, until you get to that final palate cleanser of flash fiction at the end, where it is nothing but hopefulness. There is no dark to it any longer. And that's kind of how it was born, was looking at the stories as I kind of picked out my favorites and decided, there's an idea here. There's a way to make these all work and make a collection that could be cohesive. And so that's how I ended up coming up with the idea and structuring it. It took a little bit of time. It was not there from the get-go, that's for sure.
Your characters face very personal trials, grief, guilt, obsession, fear.
Mhm.
Do you see these stories as reflections of universal human struggles?
Yes, yes. Especially in the beginning stories, because those don't have that full supernatural horror bent to them. The very first story, there's this boy running, from this fire in this what seems like a dreamlike imaginary city, but really it's him hiding and masking the terror of the building he lives in with his mother burning around him. And then he loses his mother at the end. Or there's another one that there's um, a woman loses her husband, and toward the end of it, you realize that she has a memory that's fleeting because she has dementia. And actually, that particular story is very personal for me, because that is based on my grandmother who had Alzheimer's, and that actual scene written around my grandfather was the scene. That is how it actually played out as we watched him take his last breath. So kind of just exploring these ideas of these different emotions of loss and trials that we go through, and exploring this other aspect of what could be horror, because you have your traditional, your supernatural stories, you're running from a monster or a killer, but some of the scariest things in life are just what can happen to us in terms of dealing with different emotions around loss. Um, Loss from losing a loved one to maybe you lose what you remember, like my grandmother did, losing those memories. Um, so that is something that I explored a lot in these stories, and they were at different points where I was trying to process things that were going around in my own environment.
The title, Menagerie in the
Mhm.
Dark, feels symbolic. What does it mean to you, and how does it capture the essence of this book?
Yes. So, like I said, with the thematic arc of this collection, it, dives into the dark before becoming brighter at the end. But that whole idea of the stories getting darker, the menagerie, it's usually a collection of animals, but for me, it was this collection of characters that are basically navigating and through the darkness. And so while each one has a different set of characters and they don't all lead together, this collection of characters all goes through their own dance in the dark to some respect as they're trying to navigate the situation and scenario that they're in.
Let's talk about a couple of the stories. Touch on not to give too much away, but one of your stories
Yeah.
features a man who repeatedly enters, fascinating to me, the moment of his wife's death, convinced he can change it. Where did that idea come from?
So, which is it's really interesting because originally, and here's something else about that story. So I had a scene in my head, and I think it was partially, I remember, I think it's the third book of the Dark Tower series, maybe by Stephen King. It had a door on the cover. I can't remember which one exactly it was. So that doorway, I remember seeing that on the cover image, and my mind wandered to when I was a kid after I saw that, because here's the mind of a writer. You see something and then your mind just goes wild. And to the Twilight Zone. And just all these different things that happened, and then a little bit of Tales of the Crypt. My mind just went kind of down this like own rabbit hole of, of its own. And so I wrote this scene. So the first, just the funeral part at the beginning of the story, that was the only scene I had written about 10 years ago. And it was all based on seeing that cover of that Stephen King book, and my mind just kind of went off on its own. And then a year and a half ago, when I started editing and looking at the stories that were my favorites, and I'm like, okay, I want to get these polished and, professionally ready to like make into something. That story went from the initial about 3,500 words that it was to 22,000 words. Because for me, I wrote that scene, but it, nothing was really summed up. And for me, I'm like, there's so much more. What happens after the funeral? And so revisiting that and putting myself back in that mindset of that initial spark of idea of, okay, he sees her death through this doorway, but what if he could go back? And what does that do to somebody if they become so desperate because of this loss that they keep going back, convincing themselves that they can change it? But every time they do, things appear a little bit worse. Is it something he's actually seeing? Is he affecting it? What is that doing to him psychologically, to her loved ones that are still also surviving her, watching this happen? And so I just went on this journey with this character and just kept writing and writing until I kind of got to, that 22,000 word point. And I'm like, okay, I think I got a real nice story here. I think this is wrapped up. So that was the journey I took with that one.
Yeah, you mentioned the Twilight Zone. This collection does feel very cinematic, almost like a series of Twilight Zone episodes for the modern era. Another story in the book is the nurse character who secretly administers a deadly cocktail that's chilling. How do you get inside the mind of morally complex and or dangerous characters?
So a lot of times with characters like that, it's a lot of research because naturally I don't think that way as those particular types of characters would. So I have an interest in true crime. So reading about those characters and the psychology of them or real life examples. So with that particular one that you're talking about, Nancy is the nurse in that particular story, and that is based on I believe Jane Toppin, I think was her name. They called her Jolly Jane, and that was a nurse who killed her patients around 1900. And so, reading about her, it was that's what inspired that story, and looking at her psychology, because a part of it was I wanted to make it realistic and chilling, but sometimes with real life in a story, you try to create these dynamic characters that will do things that when a reader reads it, they'll buy it and they'll go. And when that happens, there always seems to be this formulaic part of it where people are like, oh, that part's not realistic. But then when you actually read about some of these killers or individuals, there isn't a formula. Sometimes what they do, it's like it might not seem realistic, but read about the real people. What they do isn't necessarily predictable. There isn't always this set pattern that you get in fiction. So a lot of what I like to do is just read about numerous characters and go, okay, what is within the realm of possibility? And but what can I push to get people into the story enough without taking them out of it. So at what point where it's like, okay, that's you've went a little too far, even if it's realistic. So it's, finding that balance of adding in maybe this is traditionally more what they would do, but let's make them a little bit more unique and push it as far as we can go. And so it's really just looking at what are some real world examples of this, and then what can I make original and unique about them.
You've written both a short story collection and novella, as I mentioned in the introduction. What do you enjoy most, Chris, about short fiction as a format?
Sometimes just short, what I really enjoy about short fiction, especially a good short story collection, is y- sometimes you don't have a lot of time to read an entire book, or you just want a complete story and you have an hour, 30 minutes, or even if you read before bed and you want to read something that concludes itself fully. A lot of big novels, we have page turners and things of that nature, but normally 6 to 8 hours to read, a thriller, a book like that. And what's great about a short piece of fiction is you can still have someone hit all of those beats, still feel all that emotion, have an entire story arc in a shorter amount of time, and just have this nice, satisfying piece that you are able to read and process without having to go to stop in the middle of the action and having to go, okay, I'll come back to it. And then and then it's like this drawn out. Of course, I'm definitely working on being a novelist as well. But short fiction is how I learned, and it really taught me how to be more concise because you still have to hit all of the major pieces of a story to make it satisfying for a reader. And it is unfortunate that it isn't a art form that has as many avenues anymore. There were a lot of publications where you used to get your short stories published in them, and that's becoming fewer. And now with how quick, um, with different social medias, there's, with algorithms and the shorter amounts of time you have to catch people, I think this is a good time to almost have a short story renaissance. Bring that back because that is the way a lot of people process the world now, and you could get such great fiction in such short little pieces. Some full-length movies are based on short stories written by Stephen King, etc. So just because it's shorter, it can be just as good as a long form. And I really enjoy that medium.
How did you become a writer?
So I will say what is the cliche thing to say is, oh, I wrote when I was young. However, went to college, did all those things. Went out of high school, went to college, tried to, start a particular career, and writing went to the wayside. And it was a hobby, something I was interested in. I always liked to read. But it wasn't until after college, I managed a Barnes& and Noble for a while after I got out of college. And so I started getting exposed to books a lot
Yes.
more. Whereas during college, you're reading a lot of what you're told to write or to read. And so then it was back to reading for enjoyment. So um, when doing that, it took me back to remembering how much I enjoyed stories and that escape that it gives you. And and I just started jotting things down again. I was never really into journaling, but I would just write down little stories or I'd read a book and I'd be like, oh, this is a cool idea. And at first it started with just jotting down ideas. And then what was really great about working um, at that bookstore is I met two who are now very close friends. We've been friends for about 15 years now, who are also writers. They went to, they got their English degrees. They wrote as a hobby as well, and we started our own little writers group. And from there, we would, oh, let's just write little short stories. So back to the short stories, and let's share them with each other and critique each other. And it just grew from there that it was filling something I didn't realize was missing. But once I identified it, I'm like, this is something I need. So then when, you know, things I had hard times, or if there was some kind of trauma, writing became my outlet for just ideas, creativity, processing that trauma. Um, and it kept developing until it's like, you know what, this is what I felt like I was meant to do. So let's go for it. All of my, when I have free time, let's just keep writing and building these ideas and keep honing that craft. And it went from there. So even though, yes, as a little kid, my mom saved all these little notebooks where she's like, "Oh, look at the story you wrote. I always knew." And I'm like, "Did you?" Because I didn't talk about it again until after college. It's something it's almost like I came home to something that was always there. I just let life get in the way and, oh, I want to try this, career. I'm going to go to business school and I'm going to do these things. And then it's like, this is really what I felt like I was meant to do.
When readers finish the last page of Menagerie in the Dark, what do you hope they carry with them?
That no matter how dark it gets, there is always tomorrow. There is always light. There is always the light of the next day that will be there. So there's a lot of trials and tribulations we'll go through, and hopefully they're entertained by the stories, but reading deeply into them, because there is a lot of deep topics throughout that book and types of trauma that, as dark as it gets, it can it can get better. There can be a brighter tomorrow, and look for that hope, whether that's escaping through stories, writing yourself, talking with someone, whatever way you need to process it. Tomorrow can be better, and it will be better. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks for joining me.
Yes. Thank you very much, Steve.
The book is Menagerie in the Dark. Chris Kauzlarich. It's available now wherever books are sold. For more about Chris, his work, and upcoming projects, visit him online or follow him on social media. You've been watching the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Thank you for joining us.